time to use our first directive. A directive, as we have covered in the introductory video, is a way that we can bind specific behavior to an element or a component. Now in our case, we're going to bind it to an element. Now we're going to use something called the ng style, so the Angular style directive. What this essentially is a more superpowered style binding, which allows us to specify an object and get a bit more complex when we need to set multiple styles. It's probably a good practice to use it if we're going to be adding lots of inline styles. If we need to add 1 to 2, maybe 3 inline styles, using this style binding approach I think is perfectly acceptable. If we then start to build out our code base and have even more and more inline styles, it probably makes sense to keep things in a single place. So that is where our ng style directive can come into play. So what we essentially want to do is convert our style.border over, and we're going to use ng style. What we need to then do is pass in an object. This will be an object made from properties that denote the CSS we want to bind. So in our example, we wanted to bind a border, so we can say exactly that. And based on our condition, our ternary statement will take care of the rest. So then if we hit save, we're not actually going to see anything different. And if we inspect element, we're also not going to see anything different. We have our inline style, which is being painted as it was before. However, we have this ng reflect ng style. This is just something that Angular is using to keep track of those objects for you under the hood in the background, so we don't need to worry about it, but that is of course what it is for. So this means that we can now take the approach of adding any more styles that we want. Now we won't keep this, but for demonstration purposes, we're also going to change the background. So we're going to say if it is of type promotion, then we're going to use a red background, or we can switch to a green background. So we can then hit save and we can see those changes reflected in the DOM. Now what is interesting is background itself. And the reason that we're demonstrating background is because background is shorthand for specifying multiple arguments in CSS. So for example, we might say background, then the color, and then the URL, no repeat, and these types of things, and that is CSS related. What we are really doing is doing background-color, and you can see that this is giving us an error. It's giving us this error because this is now an object property. So if we want to use it, we then need to specify those quotes around it. So for any special properties that we are adding that do have that hyphen, we then need to add those quotes at the beginning and the end. Much like in JavaScript, we need to know that it is in fact a valid property name. There's also one more feature that I want to show you, and that is the ability to add a font size, but also specify the units. And this is a special Angular feature. We could, for example, do something like this and specify 20 pixels. But if we save this out, this isn't going to have any change because we are hard coding some sizes down in here. So for illustration purposes, we can uncomment these and our text is then at font size 20. Now this is using pixels as the unit, but let's assume that we get some data back from the server and it is in fact the number 20 by itself. We would then need to go in and manually append like we would doing something like this, or we could use some ES6 string interpolation. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just take the raw number and then pass it onto this? We can in fact do exactly that. We can say font size and specify the unit as an extension of the property that we want to then use. If we then save this out, this works perfectly. If we then change this to something quite small, you can see that it is working. We can then switch to a different unit such as rem, which makes things absolutely giant based on the relative m, which is what rem stands for. M's will also pick up the same in our example. We also have some other units such as points, but most commonly we'll be using things such as px. So that's an interesting example for us to combine with our code, is to use the pixels. So if we undo those changes, that was just for demonstration purposes. But you can see the power of Angular's style bindings and also using ng style. Personally, I quite like to use the style for single inline styles. If I'm going to start adding more, it's far easier to have a whole object with a lot of information as it's all in one place. And what we can in fact do here is pass in a function if we wanted to. So we can, instead of passing in an object, we could have a get styles function, which we could then, inside the body of our component, we could then have get styles, and inside then go ahead and return a bunch of styles based on some data coming in, you name it. So the possibilities are endless in terms of how we want to compose it. This just accepts an expression, and we can pass in an object, a function, an array, and it's up to you what you want to use. However, most commonly, you will use something like an object, and I'm going to stick with this approach because this is the most common way, and I don't see too many use cases to deviating away from it. So that's it for this lesson. We're going to talk about setting classes with class bindings and also look at a new directive called ngClass.